which means I'm going to take care of you if anything happens, but then you're going to listen to me. So if we have to leave this room, the exit is right out here to your left. It goes right out to the street. If the problem's out in front, we're going to go to the back. If the problem's in the back, we're going to go to the front. So just follow me. We're going to be fine.
I'll get you out of here.
You'll get me out of here. Let me just say, I'm delighted that you're all here today, and this is going to be a wonderful conversation. I've just had the privilege of listening to one of the most interesting but troubling discussions in many years. It was about the challenges that this very sophisticated country, this very rich, sophisticated country and government, and the way we stumble over ourselves all the time to try to get the government coherently organized around a strategy. I hope we get into a bit of that in this discussion today. One of the most formative experiences in my professional life occurred when I was the comptroller at the Defense Department and went to Bosnia. This was in 1996, I think it was. The shooting the active shooting had stopped, but there was a lot of skirmishing, little things going on. And I went to meet with the commanders, a two-star general officer that was commanding our forces at that stage, and comptroller, money, that kind of thing. So I said to him, General, what do you need? You know, what is it that I should hear you tell me that you need that I can help you with? And his answer surprised me. He said, I need about $50 million that I can use to help launch development projects. He said, you know, when I go into a village, and if I come roaring in a Bradley, you know, and everybody around me has got guns, people kind of hold back, you know, they're not leaning forward. But if I can walk in, I drive in a Humvee, and I see the mayor, and I say, Mayor, you know, they gave me a couple of $1 million, and I got to spend it. Is there something you and I could work on together? He said, the world changes. Now, that was the most formative experience I think I had when I was a comptroller, to all of a sudden realize that, you know, security is not just being able to kick open any door, you know, and kill any bad guy inside, but it's creating this new dynamic of hope after you've had to do something difficult. This is what the good general has wrestled with his whole professional career, certainly. We were just talking downstairs about his time in Iraq, and he said something. 90% of his time, he was trying to figure out how to get jobs so that people would stop being hostile. I mean, that was a remarkable insight, you know. And it's not something that we know and we understand very well in this town, and we're forgetting it. There's an amnesia that's setting in this town about how do we help reconstruct society after we've had to go to war. So this is a rare opportunity for us to listen to an architect and a practitioner, and I'm very, very grateful that John Kelly will be with us today. I'm not going to spend time on his resume. You know, you all came because you knew his resume. But for us to see a man who started off as an enlisted man and to become a 4-star general in the Marine Corps, this is one exceptional individual. Would you please welcome him with your applause?
General, thanks for being here. I think the audience has voted with their feet. You have a very sizable audience, I think, reflecting the fact that they wanted to hear you, but also to say thank you for your public service. And I wanted to ask you several questions about your current day job, but also some questions related to your career. And I think Dr. Hamre had alluded to some of them. But I thought maybe we might just start with, tell us a little bit about what you're currently doing in your current day job as commander of Southcom as it relates to Central America. Because I first met you at the Halifax Security Forum more than a year and a half ago, and we had done some writing here at CSIS about the need for a Plan Colombia for Central America. You had read that. And when I meet a 4-star general and he says to me, I need you to come to Miami, I say, yes, sir. And so I was an honor, of course, to be with you in Miami. But tell us a little bit about how you're thinking about the issues in Central America, because I don't think they're related to security, but they're much larger than that. And so thank you for being here. Please
Thanks,
share.
Dan, and thanks for the interest, certainly. I'm happy to do that. Southern Command, if you don't know, I've got the Caribbean for the most part, with the exception of the Bahamas for some reason, and all of the rest of the Southern Hemisphere with the exception of Mexico. Mexico is in the Northern Command area of responsibility, but because Mexico Northern Command touches my command, that is right at the Guatemalan border, we have great relationships with both Northern Command and the Mexicans as well. So in a lot of ways, that first 100 or so miles of Mexico, we're pretty in pretty close coordination with the Mexicans. Anyways, I mean, there's good news stories across the region, and there's a few bad news stories. The bad news stories, to a large degree, are a result of U.S. drug consumption. I don't worry about marijuana, but all of the cocaine produced or consumed in the United States comes from Latin America, Colombia, really. All of the heroin, 100% of it from Central America and Mexico, and then about 90% now of the methamphetamine. You know, the end result of that in our country is right at 40,000 dead a year, year after year after year, from another kind of terrorism, narco-terrorism. And it costs the U.S. taxpayer roughly $200 billion a year. So what has that done? The cocaine and drugs come into the United States. Just cocaine alone, we think the profits are about $85 billion a year. Unlimited amount of money, really. And that's the big money maker, by the way. And so the cocaine and the drugs and the network that it travels on that moves anything, guns, women, other people, you know, human beings, potentially terrorists, potentially anything. All you have to do is pay the fare, but the network is very, very well developed, and it's a world, really it touches worldwide networks. And we can talk about that if you want. But in any event, the traffickers have no problem getting drugs, people, anything into the United States. And what comes out of the United States, again, are the profits. You know, we at Southern Command don't count money when we get it, we weigh it. You know, we'll say, okay, we got a ton of money yesterday. Sir, over the weekend we captured a ton of money. You know, and think about the weight of a single bill. So their biggest problem is not getting drugs and that kind of thing into the United States. Their biggest problem is laundering money. And the other thing that comes out of the United States in vast quantities are weapons. So because of the profits, countries like Central America, used to be Colombia, not so much, not at all anymore, but the countries in Central America have completely, not completely, in many cases are nearing collapse in many ways. A story I was told by the Ministry of the Interior in Guatemala when I first took the job, he said, look, I was given, he had just gotten into the job, he said, I was given an offer of $5 million to not, just to do one thing, don't go after this particular cartel within Guatemala. And he said, I wouldn't do that. And I told him, you know, go to hell. So the guy who had offered him the money said, okay, then we can kill you for $1,000. Or we can kill your family for less than that. So he gets a CD in the mail, and in the first sequence in the CD, it's him and his wife, or it's him and his two little girls leaving the house, 7 and 5, I think, going to school in the morning. The next CD, him and his wife and his two little girls going to mass on a Sunday morning. You get the point. So this vast amount of money has caused these northern tier countries, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, the bottom part, the southernmost part of Mexico, to really, to say the least, be at risk. That's where I walked into this job. It had been going on for some time. And all of the things that they need in that part of the world, more than anything else, they need economic development and jobs and things like that. Because what we find is people don't really want to leave their homes where they grew up unless there's no opportunity or unless the violence. And that's why we have so much illegal immigration coming up from the Central American countries. You know, last year, summer before last, we had 70,000 young people, mostly under the age of 18, put on into the network, about $1,500 to $2,500 depending, but put into the network. And you know, there was a huge outcry in the United States about that. I didn't defend them, but I simply said, look, if this is not, I mean, the questions I was getting about parents putting their children into the network to move them to the United States, like, don't they care about their parents? I mean, their kids, don't they love their kids? I said, yeah, actually, they love their kids as much as we love our kids. Putting them into that network is almost will surely save their lives, because the network is efficient. You pay into it, the network will deliver what you pay for. So the vast majority of those kids made their way up in the United States on the network and are still here and are being well taken care of by the U.S. government to the tune, I understand, of about $100 million a year. So but they don't want to leave. It's just that the violence is so incredible. You know, Honduras, better now, but still listed as the most violent country on the planet. 91 deaths per 100,000 is the official number. The United States is about 5 deaths per 100,000. These are UN figures. El Salvador is 49 or 50. You know, so these are very, very violent countries. Now,
is that some of the highest death rates in the world?
In the world, oh yeah, there's no doubt. Higher than Afghanistan by a geometric factor. And I was once pushed back by someone in the interagency saying, you know, John, you always claim that all of the violence is due to the drug trafficking, and we don't think it is. And I said, okay, the root of the problem 10 years ago, 15 years ago, was in the collapse of their legal justice system, their police, the corruption. It really all came as a result of the drug trafficking, and they acknowledge that. But today, I was taken to school that it's not all because of drug trafficking. Now again, the police are all corrupt. The legal justice system doesn't work. The good people are intimidated to do their jobs. So I said to this individual who has a lot more experience in the region than I do, say, okay, how much of it then is due to the drug trafficking? And they said, well, at the most 80%. So I said, okay, I'll give you the, you know. But as an official in Honduras told me, you know, you can shoot your wife in the lobby of the police station during shift change, and you probably won't get arrested because they'll be afraid that you, having shot your wife, you may have something to do with the cartels, and they don't want to risk it. And even if you do get arrested, you can bribe your way out, or the courts will let you go, bribes. So I mean, that's where they are. And that said, there's a lot of good things going on even in those violent countries, even those countries. And there are good, decent men and women that are really trying to make a difference. You know, everyone from lawyers to, hate to say anything good about a lawyer, but lawyers to prosecutors to judges. But they are afraid, and they should be afraid. You know, we take for granted in the United States that we have clean police, that we have a functioning legal justice system, that we have an FBI that does what they do, have an NSA, a CIA, a US military that does what we do. We take for granted that there's a certain level overwhelming level of honesty within our institutions. Not necessarily competence in all of our institutions, but an overwhelming level of honesty. And most of the rest of the world simply do not have that. And we tend to, in this city, mirror image. So when I'm told that those people down there, I love the finger, that's always the finger, those people down there, and it might be the Caribbean countries, why aren't these countries tracking the homegrown ISIS motivated folks that are going to Syria? Well, they can't track them. They don't have an FBI. They don't have an NSA. They don't have a CIA. You know, they don't have a homeland security like we do. And that's why they need, and they're open to us helping them. But we tend to say, why don't those people, when we've got all of the advantages? And these countries are really, really struggling. Sorry.
So I've got 7 seats up front. I know we have standing room only, so don't be shy. We're all friends here, so you can, please come on up and grab some of those seats. General, I want you to tell the story about you've painted an accurate picture of what's happening in the region. Talk about your role in helping move, and in partnership with others, some of the responses to the challenges in the Northern Triangle, because I think that's a very illuminating story.
If I understand the question, I mean it's the
Alliance for Prosperity.
Yeah. Again, when I took the job, and you know, these guys are not perfect, guys and gals are not perfect, but when I took the job and started meeting with the presidents and the ministers of defense and interior economics and all of that in the northern tier countries, you know, it's clear that what they need is opportunity, educational opportunity, you know, a reason to stay home, and a reason to stay out of the drug gangs if they can, because the one thing you can guarantee in the drug gang, you will have a good time for a while. You'll have money in your pocket, you'll have women, but you will be dead at a young age. So the parents are struggling to keep their children out of the drug gangs, but there's no opportunity. So the option is, again, as I mentioned, to send them to the United States, which they try to do. So in talking to the three presidents of the countries, and again, they're not, by no means are they perfect,
is El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras.
Right. We encourage them. Now we bring the other countries in, Panama, Costa Rica, Nicaragua when they want to play, Mexico. But the northern tier countries, as Dan just said, are those three countries that we work with. We encourage them to talk to each other and develop some type of a regional approach. Very small countries. If you solve the problem in El Salvador and don't solve it similarly in Honduras, it's pointless. So they started to do that. They started to work these issues. We had some conferences, brought business people together. People from the interagency came down. We had the conference in Miami, a series of them. Down from Miami, guys like Dan came, and just to discuss the issues that were pressuring that part of the world. Now, a lot of times I'm told that these countries are all over the edge. They're too far gone. Don't waste your time. But the real bright, shining example in all of this is Colombia. Now, Colombia was as bad off 15, 17 years ago as Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala is today. And one of the things we did, and the miracle of Colombia is overwhelmingly done by the Colombians themselves. Yes, they got a lot of encouragement by the U.S. We gave them some money, 4 cents on the dollar for Plan Colombia, but they did it all themselves to a large degree. We helped, but a lot of people in this town take credit for Plan Colombia, but the Colombians deserve it first and foremost. And the credit that we deserve, I think, we had some remarkably effective country teams, ambassadors there, a series of them, and they really did remarkable things. But in any event, the then Minister of Defense, Juan Pinzon, he's now their ambassador to the United States recently, 90 days ago. But I asked Mr. Pinzon, young guy, Princeton grad, if he wouldn't mind doing kind of a seminar for me in Miami with the senior-most representatives from the three countries and talk to them bluntly about where his country was 15, 17 years ago, what his country needed to do socially, economically, tax code, reform the military, 100 other things, and then take us through what has become the miracle, I think, of Colombia. It's not perfect, they got a long way to go, but he did that. It was absolutely an amazing thing to watch. And from that, now the three Latin American or the three northern tier countries sit down, work together with my staff, and they develop what they ultimately called Alliance for Prosperity. It's a social, economic, military, approach to the problem that they then, and we can get into it if you want, Tim, I don't want to take too much time, but we then got into, we helped them get that Alliance for Prosperity into the U.S. interagency. People in the U.S. interagency said, this is impressive. And that has become at least the basis by which we're hoping to help these countries, again, economically, social. You can't just talk economics and not talk social. You can't talk social without talking legal justice. And you can't talk any of it without citizen security. And right now, and I'll end it here, right now in those three countries, really the only institutions that truly work are the military. In all of those countries, like in our own country, in those countries, with the exception of the church, they are considered to be the most admired, respected, and effective organizations in the country. The people like to see the military on the street. They are afraid of the police for all the reasons I've described. But believe me, it's ugly. But there are good people in those countries, officials that are trying to move the ball forward.
What I was struck when I visited Miami were a couple things. One is that you were able to convene across the political spectrum, both political leadership, security folks, business people. I thought it was remarkable your convening power in Southcom to do that, as well as folks from the interagency. One of the things I'm encouraged by was that this Alliance for Prosperity has been housed and a lot of ownership's been taken by the Inter-American Development Bank, which is an important player here. I think it's a trusted partner. We were talking earlier that many of including yourself, there'll be a number of folks who were involved with helping get the Alliance for Prosperity started, including several of the elected political leaders, will be gone in several years. But the President Moreno of the Inter-American Development Bank was just reconfirmed for a third term, and so will be here for the next 5 years, and so will in some ways be a steward of this work. So there's some continuity there. So I just want to comment on that. I want to come back to...
Of course, the beauty of a guy like Ambassador Moreno, he was the Colombian ambassador to the United States during the critical plan, 12 years, I think.
Yeah.
And now he's the Inter-American Defense Bank.
American Development Bank.
Development, just an amazing gentleman, and you're right, the continuity is...
And he's the right person at the right time for that, given the Colombia context. We were talking at breakfast about this issue of transnational threats that you've talked about in some of your comments. Could you just expand a little bit on that? I was particularly gangs and criminal networks, because I think it seems to me that is as you've said, I mean, this seems to be the greatest security threat that we face in the Americas is transnational security threats.
Well, when I first took the job, I mean, most of my experience up until this job really was looking at bad guys with guns, whether they were state actors or terrorists or whatever, and then, of course, trying to kill them or at least deter them. In this job, it's all about, in my view, it's all about the transnational organized criminal organizations. And I had no idea how well developed the networks are. And I've come to the conclusion, I don't think I'm the only, I mean, I'm not thinking of this myself, other smarter people have, but my image of this is, you know, you picture the Earth floating in space, and it's encased to a large degree in this criminal network that is not, there's not one person, you know, pulling the strings, but they all touch and they all cooperate with each other. So if you're a bad guy or a bad gal in Pakistan and want to get into the United States, and you want to definitely get into the United States, and you pay your way onto the network, and it'll eventually touch my network, the Western Hemisphere network, and it'll get you up into the United States. And you, along the way, will get a set of a U.S. passport that will pass muster every time. And you'll get that because there's tremendous production facilities in the Western Hemisphere part of the network that will give you, you know, whatever you need to prove that you are legal in the United States. So, but the other just as disturbing thing to me is outside, you know, you get the world encased in the transnational organized criminal networks, and then increasingly, in my view, the network of Islamic extremism, terrorism, I'll say terrorism, is growing. You know, it's very well developed, very intricate, obviously in the Middle East, South Asia. More so into getting more developed, and you know, it's extended into the Philippines and of course Indonesia, but it's also growing in the Western Hemisphere. Nothing that keeps me up at night right now, but there is, you know, we're seeing it start to develop, and of course the nightmare would be if these two networks touch. And I'm telling you, they're touching certainly in South Asia, in the Middle East. So you have common cause between cartels that have the advantage of unbelievable amounts of money, and they get that money through drug trafficking, people trafficking, illegal gold mining. I mean, it goes on and on and on, extortion, all of that. And you have those touching Islamic extremist or terrorist organizations. We know, as an example, that the money laundering process coming out of the United States, drug money, is raising, we're not exactly sure, but certainly approaching $100 million in fees, if you will, that go into the coffers of some Islamic terrorist organization. We know, if you talk to the Europeans, as the cocaine moves out of the Western Hemisphere into Western Africa and then up into Western Europe, we know there are Sunni, you know, Al-Qaeda or ISIS type organizations that are allowing it to pass, and they take their fair, what they consider to be their fair share. So we're seeing that. South Asia much more developed, where you actually have now, I think, a convergence in some cases between extremist organizations who are also making fantastic amounts of money out of the mostly drug trade, heroin trade in South Asia as it moves up production and then as it's distributed around the world. So pretty bad news.
So related to this, what percentage of your day job is focused on purely, let's call it military security issues, and what percentage of your day job is related to things other than purely military issues?
Yeah, I mean, purely military, very little. Clearly there's no military threat from the United States.
To the United States.
To the United States, and from the United States.
Yeah.
I promise.
Right.
Now that said, I mean, as I mentioned before, there is a terrible threat to the United States in terms of narco trafficking. And again, the numbers are 40,000 a year and $200 billion in national treasure that we pay out to deal with it, and not very effectively. And that's not law enforcement, by the way. That's mostly attempts at medical care and attempts at rehabilitation, all that. So not a military threat from the region to us, and with a possible exception of one or two places, very, very, very unlikely there'd be any state-on-state violence. So I spend most of my time not worrying about that, but worrying about the network and the narco trafficking. And frankly, a lot of my time is broadening and deepening relationships in some cases that we already have with countries. Because most of the countries in the region, are very positive about the United States. They want to do business with us. And they want to have a relationship, law enforcement and military relationship. They like that. They like the fact that we are now, the U.S. approach, certainly the Southcom approach when we interact with people in the South, is as equal partners and not as dominant partners. It's hard to do because we are a big dog, but I would say that certainly my organization, and not just because of me, but in general, have really mastered, I think military people actually do it very, very, very well, mastered the ability to talk to people even that are not capable, very small, but to talk to them as equals, allow them to have their pride and dignity in who they are, because they're all proud of who they are, even if it might be a real small country with only one tank or something. We're very, very good at it. I'm not so sure sometimes we are as good, that other parts of our government are as good at it.
I want to come back to that.
But they're very, very, very open to us. Venezuela's not, Nicaragua, there's some countries down there that didn't get the memo about how they should treat their people, how they should treat women, open press, all of that. Some of them, and there is some backsliding in terms of, constitutionally elected governments that are then backsliding in terms of citizen, freedoms and open press. But for the most part, it's a very, very positive attitude towards the United States. They do wish, because it isn't the source of all violence, but as the fellow told me, it's at least 80%. They do wish that we would do something to get at the root problem, and that is the drug demand in the United States. We do almost nothing to reduce the drug demand in the United States. We do a lot of things to reduce cigarette smoking, obesity. That's not working so well. Cigarette smoking's working real well. But I use the example, Dan. I mean, we know how to impact, to appeal to the better, to the.
It's like littering campaigns.
Littering campaign. Seatbelts in cars. I mean, we know how to do this, but it just stuns me that we don't have a comprehensive program to reduce drug consumption. And right now, and I'll leave with this, there's a lot of discussion in the United States about a heroin epidemic, and it's true, in the United States. But it's for 50 years, there's been a lot of heroin used in the United States, and there's been a lot of deaths from that heroin in the United States. It's primarily been located in the working class neighborhoods of the United States, or the inner city African Americans, or the barrios of where Hispanics live. And frankly, and I'll be very blunt, we seem to have been willing to accept that level of death and human misery for 50 years and just accepted it. But now that the epidemic is now added on to that, that epidemic has caught people's attention. because now it's in the suburbs. There's kids dying on the Harvard campus, in Stanford, Capitol Hill, in Beacon Hill in Boston, and Nob Hill in San Francisco, and suddenly it's caught people's attention. I wish we had kind of dealt with this problem when it was just in the working class neighborhoods, like I grew up in. Cynical enough, Len?
No, I think I wanted to, I completely agree with you. I think, General, one of the things I wanted to touch on was I was very struck by your comments at breakfast about human rights. And I think, obviously, human rights in the region, obviously, is something that's had a lot of, for a long period of time, has been of interest. But share a little bit about what you've been doing in your day job as it relates to human rights.
I would tell you that every conversation I have with any leader in the region, and frankly, this extended to when I was in Iraq and doing other things in my career, begin and end with a discussion on human rights. And the human rights problems of issues are very similar. Many of the countries we deal with have very, very bad human rights records from the 80s. Guatemala is an example. 200,000, mostly indigenous citizens, murdered mostly by the security forces. Today it's a different army, it's a different police, but they have got to reconcile. They've got to have an accountability for that period, and we've encouraged them to do that. Other human rights issues that are big in my part of the world are the violence against women is astronomical. The narco-terrorism brings on its own human rights, kind of factor. So we begin and end every conversation with it. Throughout my time, I believe I'm the only COCOM. The Southern Command is the only COCOM with a separate human rights office that's staffed full time, and we take that out of hide. So we're not, we put money against that personally. They're very, very, very aggressive. Do
you meet with groups here in D.C.?
About quarterly, I meet with the representatives here in D.C. Most of the bigger ones, about 20 at a time, and talk about human rights issues. Initially, getting me educated on it, but oftentimes they would come up with, "Hey, can you check with Honduras on this? We're hearing that the Sisters of Mercy have been." Whatever, and who come, by the way, to the human rights roundtables we have. And then I also, when I visit the countries, very seldom do I visit a country that I don't meet locally with human rights groups and get their view, and oftentimes two separate views. But talking to, and I'll just end with this, unless you want to go on, but talking to particularly the military guys in the country, I think it's been useful that I have a fair amount of recent combat experience and command experience in Iraq. And military men and women in wars are, generally speaking, very protective of their people. And when there's an overreaction, read a war crime, the tendency is to, and I understand this, I'm the same way, the tendency is to say, look, this young man has been in combat, he's seen his friends blown up, et cetera, and yes, okay, he overreacted. But what I've been able to do, I had some personal experience with this in Iraq, to where people working for me, young men, overreacted in the term a bad kill. And as I say to these generals down in the region I work with, say, you have a then decision when you find out about something like this. You can do what I did, and that is investigate it, hold them accountable, and if necessary, punish them, or you can cover it up. If you cover it up, A, it's going to be eventually uncovered, and then your credibility will be horrible. It's the My Lai, I always use the My Lai massacre in our own military experience. It was bad enough that 410 people were murdered that day in My Lai, but the cover-up that went all the way here into Washington was a real disgrace on the institution. And I believe from that, the Guatemalans, as an example, have begun to work with human rights groups about the mass graves, exhuming the bodies, and I've been to some of the locations, and start the accountability process. It's a big thing in my life, human rights.
General, let me pivot to sometimes when you were trying to help your friends and our partners in the region, some folks in the interagency would say you're getting out of your lane. Could you talk a little bit about, not so much about whether in your lane or out of your lane, but could you talk about in an ideal world, what would an effective civilian counterpart look like? So not necessarily speaking to critiquing anybody or running necessarily replaying old arguments, but perhaps think about what would a strengthened civilian counterpart look like, and what would they be doing? What would you like to see your civilian counterparts doing in an ideal world?
Well, perfection would be they do anything I tell them to do. But that's not.
But we're not going to be able to get there. But
no, you know, one of the interesting things, and we're all the same. I mean, bureaucracies are bureaucracies. We have, you know, the one single thing a bureaucracy does before anything else is protect its rice bowl, right? And when you start getting into someone else's rice bowl, the shields go up, and they start to want to protect. And as soon as you stop getting into their business, then they go back to doing whatever they were doing before. You know, one of the things when we've had conferences, there's two groups of people that come to, when you're operating outside your lane, there's two people that come to the conferences. The people that come to, no kidding, you're having a conference on economic development in Central America, I'm in. And then you have another group.
I was one of those.
Yep, you were one of those.
Yeah.
There's another group that comes in and says we need to go to that conference to make sure we know what Kelly's doing, because we may have to push back on him. The rice bowl protection thing.
Well, just on that, Ambassador Tom Shannon showed up to support you. He was in the first category,
Right.
not the second category. I think many of you know him. He's a very distinguished Foreign Service officer, former ambassador to Brazil, and former Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere. I think he heard a lot of chatter saying, "Don't do this," but he stepped forward because he
Right.
wanted to support you, and he's your friend.
Right. But I think culturally, I mean, I think people in my line of business, where we the military is very mission oriented. Give me a mission, you start to do planning, you put money against the planning, you put intellect against the planning, and then you start doing it. And frankly, if there are other people that you try to draw into that because they're the experts, or they have money, or it's their job, and you try to draw them into it, sometimes their culture is less of a bias for action and more of a hesitation, or I got to check with my boss or something like that. So, but I have found over the years, whether it's Iraq or here and other things I've done, if you just start having the meetings and start pushing forward, the initial reaction tends to be, let's try to slow it down, let's criticize it maybe, and then after a while, when you don't, you're clearly undeterred, then they jump on board. But really and truly, in terms of this kind of economic development, things like that, I don't know enough about it. I don't think most of the federal government institutions are inclined to be able to do it. And my view is you bring in, to the greatest degree you can, people who really understand it, and that's the private sector.
And
we had a conversation just a little while ago where a gentleman from Walmart, and he I don't know if he's still here, but they've got hundreds of Walmarts in Central America, in southern Mexico, hundreds of Walmarts. I mean, I had no idea until an hour ago. And he thinks probably roughly 70,000 people in those countries are working in those hundreds of Walmarts. And they're making money, they're selling whatever they sell in Walmarts fairly cheaply, certainly cheaper than Harris Teeter. And there's
That wasn't a paid promotional.
right. And there's benefit to what they're doing. I don't know, I'm sure the federal government probably has some job development programs, but I bet they haven't created 70,000 jobs. I would rather see, it's like the Inter-American Development Bank. When we were very successfully informing and educating Congress to get ultimately $1 billion put against the Alliance for Prosperity initially, my argument then was, let's give it to Luis Moreno Let's give him the $1 billion because he knows how, and his organization knows how to develop places economically. Now, obviously the Congress would still do oversight and all that kind of thing. But if they're the experts, and what you're trying to do with with Biden's billion, we got it named that. He loved it. Vice President loved it. And of course that's how you draw people in too. But if they're the experts and it's all about economic development, then why don't we give it to the people that really know how to do it, and have other elements of the U.S. government, State Department, AID, and everything be part of that as well. But the driving force in terms of where to put the money, where to invest, and all that would be, in my opinion, those that really know how to do it, and that's the private sector.
So I want to come back to the private sector in a minute, but let me just push on the issue of relationships with the Hill. Why does, we were talking about earlier about combating violent extremism, and I think the military is going to get over $1 billion, and AID, I was told, is going to get less than $50 million to work on specifically combating violent extremism. Now, I think in any ideal world that would be, there's a mismatch there. Mm-hmm. You've done a lot of work on working with the Hill. You've had experience working on, with the Hill. Could you talk a little bit about what, not so much assigning blame, but what is it, how do we make the successful case for strengthening civilian capacity with Capitol Hill? And talk a little bit about how you've done some of that.
The way you do it is you go up to Capitol Hill and talk to them.
Does that sometimes not happen?
The military is really good at it. We're very effective at it. A lot of times, I worked on Capitol Hill for 4 years, but I've got some follow-on assignments that brought me in close contact with Capitol Hill. To be very simplistic, I have found Capitol Hill to be they want information, they want to understand, and all you got to do is go up and tell them. And you have to understand there's many agendas up there. 535 members of Congress. They all have state and district agendas. You got to understand that, sure. Their staff many times have their own agendas that are not necessarily. So there's probably a couple thousand agendas up there. But the basic agenda is we want to know what you need, why you need it, and we'll deliberate on it and decide whether we'll give it to you or not. So where the military is up there all the time, oftentimes because they're told, come up here and justify why you need the jet, or justify why you need the whatever
tank.
It is, the tank, or justify why you need, but also what do you need? And I don't think, at best, when I've seen other government agencies go up there, they hold their nose when they're up there.
Is it because they're told not to go up there, or it's because they're afraid something will? I don't want to just speculate too much, but
I don't know.
Okay.
And I'm not talking about lobbying here. Of course, it's illegal for us to lobby, from within the federal government. But if they want to be informed and educated, I'll go up there and inform and educate the hell out of them as often as they want, and tell them, what we're doing. I mean, when we were originally going up on the Alliance for Prosperity, and they weren't the defense committees, they were the other committees.
The check writing committees for the civilian agencies.
And when you get this, gee, we didn't know that, or boy, we didn't realize it was that good or that bad. So I think I'm willing to go anywhere and do anything legal to accomplish the mission I've been given, whether it's in my lane or not.
Exactly, I understand. Okay, I want to talk about the private sector. Our friend Paul Brinkley's here, who wrote Warfront to Storefront, and you mentioned it when we had an event at CSIS. We did the Global Development Forum, and you were kind enough to come up to do that last April. And we did that in partnership with our friends at Chevron, and this is a Chevron forum. And so the private sector matters, whether it's Walmart or Chevron or Boeing. There's American companies are all over the world and have a role to play. So could you talk a little bit about what struck you about that book, and then talk a little bit more about the role of the private sector and what role it has to play in the conversation we've just been having? Yeah,
the book, first of all, I from the point at which I read it, and I knew Paul a little bit in my last job in Iraq. The whole thing about the book that Paul writes about is, and he was working with the Defense Department. He's a businessman. He knows how to economically develop stuff, and he was head of the Joint Task Force that I think Secretary Rumsfeld put together but he was overseas for about 5 years and did, I think, remarkable stuff. And he wrote a book, and I read it, and I said, asked Paul to come to Miami. I coerced all of my staff to read the book, not necessarily buy it, but read it.
I bought it retail.
And but I since reading the book, I was at Kennedy School last week, Leavenworth the week before that. I was in Santa Monica talking to the Pacific Council within the last 2 weeks. Every time I talk I was down at Quantico yesterday with the General Officer Symposium. I tell people, look, if you, particularly as a senior officer, because so much what we do today and we'll do in the future has to do with not shooting and killing people. I mean, lieutenants and captains and lieutenant colonels and sergeants know how to do that. It's at the general officer or the senior officer colonel level, it's how do you change the society, how do you make the economy better. And so I think it's a hugely important book, and I never, ever, ever not mention the fact you should read that book. If you're in certain government agencies in the United States, you'll be angry, and that's a good thing, because if you're angry, you ought to change the way you do business, because what we did, the help that I asked for when I was in Iraq last from Baghdad, and I just use that as the big cloud from Baghdad, they just weren't responsive, or when they did send what I asked for down, it was something that was totally different, and I just started doing my own thing, and spending my own money and going to Jordan, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and bringing people in to invest or whatever. So I'm as I say, a huge believer in breaking China when you need to, but certainly the answers are not always in the federal government and in the federal programs. And the Rice Bowl thing and the protection of the Rice Bowl, I think, inhibits us and frequently in what we do. Dr. Hamry was saying a few minutes ago downstairs that what we really need to do is come up with, let's just get a blank piece of paper, a blank butcher block or something, and let's just redesign it so that the federal government that has certain expertise, combined with the military that has certain expertise, combined with the private businesses that have tremendous expertise, the human rights groups, and let's rewrite the whole thing and make it happen. And who cares who gets the credit, so long as whatever the United States government and its people are trying to accomplish in a given region, a given country, that mission's accomplished.
Okay, General, I think this has been a sobering and very honest conversation. I really appreciate it. Let me pivot and just ask you to tell us a couple things that you're optimistic about, both in the region, but also more broadly, either in Washington or more broadly, you've been either in your, just in terms more general, so that we not everyone leaves here and says, oh, everything's, because not everything is negative, and I know you feel that way too. So share a couple things that you're optimistic about, both in the region and elsewhere.
Well, I think the optimism I have in the region is that I go back to, I think there's 42 countries and 19 or something principalities. They all like us. They like us. They want to be associated with us. Sometimes they're like abused children or something. They almost beg me to love them. I mean, they know I love them, but it's like, why can't we? And it's almost always we want the relationship to be broader, deeper, and it is very broad and deep. As an example, they like our stuff, whether it's Walmart, which I didn't even know operated down there, whether it's Walmart or our military stuff or our they like our stuff and they want to buy American. The fact that they will tell you, and I'll go on the record right now and say that the stuff that China and Russia sells them is crap. On the record,
that's
it's
a technical
crap.
term.
It is. They like the quality of our stuff, whether it's fighter jets or reverse osmosis equipment to purify water and everything in between. They love our stuff. It's better, a little more expensive, but you pay what you get for. You pay for what you get. They like our stuff. They like the working with our companies. They like the logistics tail, the upgrade tail. They love our stuff. They get frustrated beyond belief because it's so hard to buy it. They want a helicopter.
Why is it so difficult?
There are rice bowls out there. I guess it's just an accusation of a human rights abuse that's unfounded can stop the whole process for years. There are many, many, many wickets to go through, and I would tell you that if you look at what they're buying, if they're buying Russian or Chinese crap, it's because they tried to buy our stuff, and they need to buy, they need it whatever it is, and they move it. So the optimism I have is tremendous relationship, broad, deep. Few countries, unfortunately, are backsliding a little bit, Venezuela being an example. So that's the real optimism. And the trade is robust between us and them. The Chinese are in there doing about a quarter, maybe 20% of the trade we do. It's getting bigger, but that's not bad for these countries. I mean, they mostly buy anyways.
I think eight of the countries today, their largest trading partner in the region is China. That's up from 15 years ago. So it's growing, but right. It's a commodity sort of relationship.
Right. So I'm not all that, I mean, I just wish, again, my pessimism is our own country and the drug demand and the fact that we're just not doing it. Most of you, I just had one of my very closest friends, his son, upscale guy, New Orleans, son overdosed on heroin the other day, Wednesday. So it's in those kind of neighborhoods. I just don't get why we are not more aggressive in terms of trying to stop the drug demand. So I'm optimistic about most things. Washington.
What are you optimistic about in Washington?
In Washington. No, I mean a lot of things. The good news is, the State Department and other organizations that look at Latin America see it. I think they see it the same way I do in terms of the positive trends and the optimism. And of course, we've just opened relations with Cuba. I don't really have much to do with that. It's being managed by the interagency. So, but I think over time, controversy aside, I think over time it'll be better for the Cuban people, and I don't think it'll be particularly good for the Cuban government over time, but I think that's a good thing. So all of it's pretty good. Washington, I mean, we're at that point in time, I think, in Washington to where nothing's going to work all that well anyways until
we have the election.
We have the election, yeah. I will say that there's, whether it's Southern Command or the President of the United States or State Department, whatever, they like us a lot. And they like the idea that we at least Southern Command say, they hate when we say it's our backyard. They hate that. They love it when we say we're neighbors. Small point. This country, Brazil, great country, huge country. They hate it when you say, what can I do to help you? They love it when you say, what can we do together? It's little things like that. The fact that even in the countries that are small and at risk, they love it when we don't tell them what to do. They love it when we ask them, how we can help. It's just little things like that. I don't know where, and I think we're particularly good at it. So.
Thank you. Those are really good insights. Okay, this audience has been very patient. I know there are a lot of smart and thoughtful people in this audience. I'm not unwilling to call on people that I know who have views, but I'd welcome a show of hands. I suspect there will be some. And so let's go ahead and start with a show of hands, and we'll group some together. Okay, so I'm going to start with my friend Mike Hess, and then there's this person over here, several seats down, and then also this gentleman here. We're going to do these three first, so we'll do them as a group. Mike?
Yeah, thank you, General Kelly. Was particularly touched on your comments about the Human Rights Center. And working with the combatant commands, we tried to encourage them, other ones, to adopt that philosophy, the use of the center, because human rights is the basis for a lot of the progress we need to make. In Africa, and there was a study recently done. I know you guys get together and talk. Why aren't
meaning the 4 stars?
Oh, the combatant commanders. Yeah. They do it all the time. Why are not the other ones picking up on this?
So we'll bunch these together, and this person here.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Courtney McBride with Inside Defense. I'm just curious, General, about any goals you have going forward that may potentially be jeopardized by some budget uncertainty. Certainly we have a short-term CR.
How about every goal I have?
We have a short-term CR. There's talk about the potential for a long-term, year-long CR. If you could speak to that.
And then this gentleman here.
Thank you very much. My name is Shimizu of Japanese Embassy. When we talk about the role of the military in development, I think that disaster relief and also PKO is very important. And
Sorry, what's PKO?
Peacekeeping operation.
Yeah,
Actually,
peacekeeping operations.
as for the disaster relief, we had 2011 tsunami and earthquake disaster, and we are very much grateful for the help the U.S. military gave us, and also. As for the peacekeeping operation, what our defense force doing in, for example, the Timor-Leste or the South Sudan, we are just constructing roads and facilities, and it's just like regular development project.
Yeah.
And actually, in Japan, people want our defense force play this role more. And but on the other hand, some say that these are not core business of the military, and there's a trade-off. And I'd like to hear your views on the role of these issues.
So thank you for that. I just want to say we really value our partnership with JICA Research Institute, and I know that Japan has just recently revisited its official development assistance charter, which is sort of its constitution for how it conducts its foreign assistance and to think about issues of security after a long debate. And I know that Japan and the United States had a very successful collaboration in response to Typhoon Haiyan, and Japan was a very generous donor as compared to China, which was not a very generous donor, and people remember that in the region. People appreciated what Japan and the United States did, and kind of also noticed that China wasn't very generous, and so it matters to our relationship bilaterally, but also with other partners. So I understand the context of why you're asking that question. I know there's also a new president of JICA that has an outlook in that direction as well. So I know that's where this is coming from. So you have 3 questions, General.
Okay, on the human rights, you can assume that in the other COCOMs, whether they have a separate office or not, human rights is big. I think in the other COCOMs, it just may be that the assumption is that everyone's doing human rights, and I think it's probably a pretty good assumption. I don't know, but again, I think there's power when you have my human rights section's 2 women, 2 people, but they're very, very aggressive ladies, and they make things happen. And the linkage between the fact that we advertise we have a human rights shop, which we do. In my involvement, I'm very, very frequently involved, as I say, almost quarterly here in Washington. When I go down to various countries, almost always meet with the human rights groups. I always try to do this through the embassy. Sometimes they send people, sometimes they don't. And I'll meet with anyone. I mean, I have sat with, you go down to the local human rights down into a country, and you might be there with, people, women's advocates, LGBT advocates, and someone who's indigenous populations advocates or something, but the point is meeting with them is powerful. I think we've developed a relationship recently with the Holocaust Museum. I think the more you can do that and get out and about. I mean, the Holocaust, they have a wonderful program over here at in terms of keeping an eye on the kind of human rights abuses that could lead to mass killings. I mean, it's a great. And it doesn't cost you anything other than an airline ticket every now and then. So the Holocaust crowd, if that's one way to put it, coming down to Miami, recommended probably January as opposed to July. But it's a good thing. So I think, but it's a big part. I think probably it started. I think Jim Stavridis might have done it because in my part of the world, even though in Africa and other places the human rights offenses have been in some cases 10 times worse than in Latin America. Latin America still has that baggage of the 80s and the wars and the CIA and all the misinformation that comes out of that. So I think it was a brilliant idea in his part to really put it up on the top. And as I say, for my case, instead of meeting annually, about at least 3, sometimes 4 times a year, but down inside the countries is where we've turned a lot of heads in terms of, boy, this guy, and it's not Kelly necessarily, but it's the 4 stars that carry. As far as the budget goes, I've said it 2 years in a row now in hearings, it would be catastrophic. I get almost no U.S. military assets in my, I wouldn't take a heavy brigade, I wouldn't take an aircraft carrier. I could use almost anything that has this is in the interdiction, the way we do interdiction down there in the high seas. Almost any vessel that carries a helicopter. Certainly a Coast Guard cutter is, more useful to me than or as useful to me as a Navy ship. But like the Dutch, they have about 6 months a year they send over a buoy tender, that is to say a ship that will go into various countries and help them put buoys in and aids to navigation. And if that thing can fly a helicopter, I can use that in the interdiction mission. And the beauty of our interdiction of drugs on the high seas is zero violence. No violence. And we get a ton and a half, 2 tons at a time. Once that drug gets into landward in Central America, Mexico, it's broken down immediately into 10, 12, 15 kilo loads, and then there's just no stopping it. I was down on the southwest border, if I could, a couple of weeks ago talking to a lady that runs the Customs and Border Protection, about 200 miles of the Texas border. I asked her how much cocaine she got last year. She said, proud as she could be, 642 pounds. That's pocket litter to me. I get 191 metric tons last year. The point is, it's the place to get it
is on the high seas.
Is on the high seas or before it leaves the country of production in Colombia. So the budget thing would be catastrophic. I get nothing. I don't know what less than nothing is, but I would get less than nothing. And of course, it also does other things internally, U.S. military, but for me it would be catastrophic. Peacekeeping. A remarkable number of countries that I deal with have either been in the peacekeeping business or are getting into it. What I tell the countries is, look, you've got a horrible human rights record from the 80s. Get into the peacekeeping business. The UN has got to certify you. If you get certified, which they will, then you become, at least today, you can argue that you are clean and you're respecting human rights. And then we can deal with the past together. I tell you who's very good at it in Colombia. I can't say enough good things about Colombia, but they've got peacekeepers in Africa, they've got peacekeepers in the Middle East, and they've deployed one of their Navy ships to Somalia, actually to the Gulf of Aden, to where they're participating in the international counter-piracy effort there, as well as ensuring the delivery of food and humanitarian assistance to Somalia. They've been out there several months, they'll come home. But they're just trying to, Colombians and others, are just trying to show that they're responsible members of the international community as opposed to just Latin Americans.
Okay, others. This woman here, this gentleman here, and this woman here, these three. We'll start with this woman here, right here.
Hi, Cassandra Campbell. I'm Turner 4D. Question on, are you using data analytics very much right now? I know that the ExecSec and the State Department has now just opened a new office that combines their data analytics with game theorists, and I know that it's been quite successful. It came out of the CSO. And understanding that they can prevent or predict conflict now, we could prevent it and kind of fill in the blanks with what we know may be coming up. Are you incorporating that a lot into what you're able to do on the humanitarian side yet, or from the private sector? I'm just interested in how that's happening.
Oh, we'll pass it down to this woman here.
Hello, hi, good morning. My name is Kelly Scavella. I'm a peace operations student at George Mason University, and I wanted to know, because you meet with so many grassroots organizations and individuals more on the ground, does it affect the way that you implement your projects at all? Do what they tell you about what's happening, does it change like anything or your perspective?
It's a great question.
And this gentleman here.
Good morning, General Otto Chrysler.
Are you still with the press?
I guess so. You talked about not wanting heavy military presence. The Corps is talking about maybe creating another special purpose MAGTF for your AOR. What would you do with that? They're having enough trouble with the two they have, giving them afloat platforms, and that seems to be your main interest.
Right.
If they gave you a special purpose MAGTF, what would you do with it?
Okay.
Can you translate into civilian for me?
Sure. well, maybe we'll start with him
Yeah.
since that's the third. Special Purpose MAGTF, Marines deploy as Marine Air Ground Task Forces. So whatever the mission we're assigned, we build the force to go do that. So think of, I'll use his example, but think of Mr. Potato Head. And depending what the mission is, if you need 5 ears rather than 2, you stick 5 ears. If you need 2 noses rather than 1. So you build the MAGTF, the Marine Air Ground Task Force, for the mission. And I do have it right now. I have and this is, in my AO, this is a big
Area of operations.
Area of operations. This is a big actual unit because most of what I get are 2Zs and 3Zs. I'll have dentists come down. I'll have, say, some manpower analysts come down and help Paraguay, develop a manpower management system or something like that. So it's very small stuff. We have almost 300 U.S. Marines that deployed down from the United States. They're about to go back. They've been with us about 5 months. 53 helicopters, heavy lift helicopters, and the rest, that's probably 50, 60 Marines, and then the rest of them are engineers. We brought medical capability down. So they're based out of Sotocano, which is a joint U.S. That's actually not joint. It's a Honduran base with his other U.S. assets there, helicopters and things like that. And they've just been doing humanitarian stuff. So they've been around either fixing schools or building clinics, moving people around. They've done some rescues at sea. The rich Americans that don't really know how to sail their sailboats a long way, and they get. And so we go risk our lives to pluck them out of the water. But I wouldn't. That's about the limit of it. A special purpose MAGTF or anything of that nature to come down for a short period of time and leave. We have some ordnance, some potential chemical ordnance removal out of an island off the coast of Panama. So the Army's putting together a task force to come down and do that. Once it's done, they'll be gone. So. Things like that are very useful, but nothing permanent. I wouldn't want anything permanent. The other thing, the beauty is when you move these guys and gals in to a region, particularly Central America, which is so dominated by the drug cartels don't know what's going on. And when they don't know what's going on, they're businessmen, and money's a coward. They don't want to risk money, so they'll start to do other things. To move their product, move their money, and that because they're off their game, so to speak, they've become a little bit more vulnerable. Even though maybe the organization that's down there is not part of the drug interdiction. But what's funny, if we do anything down there, there's a certain element within the press, our press as well, that immediately assumes it's a CIA cover for taking over a country or something like that. So we'll live with it. I could make a joke and say if the State Department's doing the analytics, you can bet we've been doing it for 15 years. But no, I have, the beauty of at least the DOD is I have the entire power of the Department of Defense and everything in it at my disposal. And the relationships we also have with the interagency. I have probably 40 members of the interagency from the Department of Energy, FBI, DEA, obviously State Department, AID, the whole power of the U.S. federal government and everything it brings to the table is a buffet for me. So yes, we're using those analytics and a host of other things to try to predict. What was it, Kelly? I think I love your first name, man. We ask people. This might come across as a little bit of a criticism, but we ask people in these countries what they need. It's just the example we gave you of the northern tier countries in the Alliance for Prosperity. I didn't tell them they needed an Alliance for Prosperity. All I suggested to them is they needed a regional approach to their economic, social, whatever problems. And they looked and said, and developed it. So they were the ones that said, we need to work, we need to have programs, I'm guessing here, but we need to have programs to increase the cacao production for chocolate, yeah. They're the ones that said we need to have in this particular region of Guatemala a focused effort against violence against women. They're the ones that developed it. We don't do that all the time. I had a conversation with some human rights groups in a country in Central America. just happened to have the deputy chief of mission with me, and we were talking about at-risk kids in, I guess it was El Salvador, and to keep the kids out of the gangs. So we were talking about this, and the DCM said, well, we have a great program for that. And I said, well, okay, what is it? And he said, well, we have this program that focuses on kids that start about 5 years old and goes to about 12 years old, and it's 10 years old, and we spend a lot of money, and it's a great program. And a great program in the sense that it's trying to get kids from going into gangs, right, at-risk kids. So I asked the question, what I thought was an obvious question: does it work? I mean, are there more kids going into the gangs? That would be failure. Are there less kids going into the gangs? That would be success. Or are the same number of kids going into the gangs? And that, in my mind, as a military guy, would be failure. And everyone agreed it's exponentially worse over the decade or so of the program. And the human rights person, one of the human rights people said to me, if you'd asked us, the program ought to start at 10, 11 years old and extend into the early teen years, because that's when they're recruited. And that program ought to be teaching these kids that at best get to 8th grade how to be hairdressers, brick masons, plumbers, electricians, give them a skill if you'd have only asked. Now that said, and a very positive example, in Colombia some years ago, USAID asked the Colombians, and so they helped the Colombians establish a technical school in, I think, Bogota, for these unfortunate members of the FARC. And by the way, the FARC is not a recruited organization, it's a kidnapped organization. They go into the villages and they kidnap young kids, 11, 12, 13 years old, and then they make them FARCsters. But they asked the Colombians said, we need a way to give these young kids that are coming out voluntarily, for the most part, out of the FARC, to give them a skill. So USAID responded to that, established a school, and ultimately recently turned it over to the Colombians as a going concern. It's a great example of the power of what the federal government, the American people can do, but it's also a great example of, why don't you ask them what they need. So yes, we are constantly pulsing people at the ground level, and then trying to, at least to the degree that I'm funded and I can legally do it, respond to that.
General, I think we should end it here, but you have been just tremendous. Thank you for giving us so much of your time. Please join me in thanking General Kelly. I'll see a lot more of you, I hope. Yeah.